Mama, 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 mommy, mama, 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 mama. Mama, 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 mama. Hmm. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, mama, mama. Mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, mama, mama. Mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, mama, mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, 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 mama. Mama, 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 mama.
Approaching the nearby ruined fort, the squad began to take stock of the situation. The ruins had some good bones. Unfortunately, it also had some bad bones, in the form of a score of ancient corpses. In a number of places, the walls had collapsed, and would need to be rebuilt in order for the fort to provide any real defense to them. The group still had some dried meat with them that had served as their food while they travelled, but if they were to remain stationary, they would have fewer chances to purchase more food than they initially expected, so they would need to grow some for themselves. Thankfully, there was a sizable area of fertile soil next to the fort. The captain had grown up on a farm, so took charge of the planting, sowing a field of carrots, a field of green beans, and a field of potatoes. With the ever-looming fear of raids from their pursuers, the squad wasted no time in chiseling some new granite bricks to patch up their walls. With their safety at the forefronts of their minds, the squad also began planning out some wooden cavalry spike barriers at the front of the fort. These would provide them with cover, while also inflicting injuries on any attackers foolish enough to try and clamber across them. If they were to be under siege for 60 days, they'd need access to water. Although they had the river close by to the east, digging a well inside the fort itself would allow them the certainty of water without leaving the safety of the walls. With so much to do to secure their position, Anna was determined to help with all of the tasks. But, as the group's medic, the captain insisted that she spend a good portion of each day meditating, to ensure that she had the required power to help mend any of their wounds or fight off infections. The dangers would come thick and fast in the coming months, so it was vital that any injuries were overcome quickly, to allow the injured squad member to get back to the front lines in time for the next attack. As such, the captain insisted that Anna take one of the larger rooms as her own, so that she could set up the jade statue which served as her focus and meditate in peace, away from the others. With the bricks starting to roll in, Kaisuke and Farrell began rebuilding the walls to the rear of the fortress, including enclosing the room they had designated for storage, in order to ensure that their supplies didn't deteriorate. Looking to restore a bit of the fort's former glory, as well as to provide a two-tier entryway for defensive purposes, the squad allocated some of their wood to a grand door in the entrance, along with a heavy wooden portcullis on the exterior. Realising that they may well end up needing an abundance of bricks to maintain their defence, the group took some time to build a proper stone-cutting bench in the back of the fort, and store a number of stone chunks nearby, ready to be processed. Before long, they'd managed to produce enough bricks to patch up all of the walls and the rooms in the fort, allowing them to replace the tattered old roof, making the fort into a livable space again for the first time in decades. Kaisuke had once served under the head of the guard for one of the kingdom's larger cities, so the squad were quite happy to leave their defences up to him. He began planning out rows of trenches and barricades, all with the aim of slowing the approach of any attackers. Although Kaisuke himself loved getting in close and personal with his warhammer, He understood the tactical advantage of having their archers safely in cover, whilst being able to pierce their approaching foes with their arrows as they stumbled through the open trenches. Living life under siege would be an intensely stressful prospect, and Jesse had already begun to voice his discontent at the prospect, so the captain knew he had to be careful to ensure that morale stayed as high as possible. As such, he was determined to offer the squad as many basic comforts as he could, including a large table in the main hall next to the hearth, where they could all sit and enjoy meals together. With both Jesse and Farrell being adept hunters, along with the fact that their dried meat had run out and the fields weren't quite ready for harvest, Jesse suggested that they go out and hunt some of the abundant wildlife in the area in order to replenish their stocks. In order to preserve any meat they hunt, the squad would need to dry it, but this would require it being left out in the sun, which would also leave any drying racks as easy targets for attackers, who could easily ruin days' worth of progress by destroying them. To remedy this, Anna suggested that they take some of the granite bricks they had and build a small courtyard onto the side of the fort. This courtyard would allow them a safe place to leave things out in the sun, where they couldn't be targeted by attackers. Speaking of attackers, the first one approached the fort. After weeks of being on edge for any danger, the captain's reflexes kicked in, and he immediately began making his way back to the rest of the squad so that they could tackle this issue together. Until that is, his brain kicked in, and he realised that his heavily armoured, heavily armed self could probably handle a small rabbit. The squad had made great progress in just a handful of days, turning some old ruins into a fully functional fort, with a small workshop, some creature comforts, a new courtyard, a food supply, and even the beginnings of some fortifications. It was almost enough to induce some hope in them. Not long after, however, the first sign of trouble appeared in the form of a single raider approaching the fort. Kaisuke was itching for a fight at this point, and although he could probably handle a single lightly armed raider all on his own, the captain was too cautious to risk losing one of their number to a careless decision, so he insisted that Farrell accompany Kaisuke. Together, they both sallied forth from the fort, meeting the raider in the field. The raider took quite a beating, but against Kaisuke's hammer and Farrell's arrows, he inevitably fell. Kaisuke took a minor beating in the process, but he was just happy to get swinging his hammer again. By chance, it appeared that there was enough room in the fort to allow each of the squad to have their own bedrooms, which would help keep morale high over the coming weeks. Even using one of the larger rooms to house their toilet, they still had space for jail cells, and even had some space left over for future development. With a lot of the basics set up and even some additional comforts, the squad got back to expanding their defences, adding an extra line of barricades and ditches, and even interspersing some wooden traps in amongst the paths they expected most attackers to take. Kaisuke also put all of them to work to extend the defences further out to try and create a funnel. The squad was only 5 strong, and it was sensible to assume a lot of the raiding parties that would target them would be larger than that. So forcing the raiders to take damage just to get close to the squad before forcing them into a choke point where their advantage in numbers would be minimised was the best course of action. The expected dangers of their situation yet to materialise, their mission had suddenly slowed from a journey across the world to retrieve a powerful artefact to now sitting enjoying their time in a cosy fort. This had allowed them to all reflect on their journey so far and all that they'd been through, which had brought them all a lot closer together. Some closer than others, it would seem, as the captain invited Farrell out for a date in the meadows, which Farrell seemed to be very interested in. Anna's focus on her meditative studies were starting to yield results, and she was beginning to feel more adept at utilising her powers to help remedy illnesses. She had been fresh out of the Academy Medica when she was chosen for this mission. Squads with magic-capable attachés were significantly more effective in the field, so any citizens with potential were offered a fast track to lieutenant after they'd finished their studies, in order to incentivise them joining the military. Even so, the military was never usually a potential's first choice, so they were still a rare commodity amongst the ranks. It was primarily thanks to Prince's direct interest in this mission that Captain Wraith had managed to secure both a medic and a geomancer for this mission. If they still had Sergeant Android with them, then Alvar would have felt a lot better about their chances of survival. Another group of raiders finally appeared, these two significantly more heavily armoured than the previous one. Although they had the defences at the front of the fort, the captain suggested meeting this attack out in the field. Although they would need to rely on their defences for larger attacks, for an attack this size it made more sense to engage them before they could get to the fort, as if they were allowed to approach the fort uncontested, they could easily set light to the fields, which weren't covered by the current defences. The fields weren't vitally important, but it made sense to protect them where possible. The raiders chose to weaken themselves further by attacking one at a time, allowing Farrell and Jesse to deal some damage to the first from a distance, before Kaisuke and the captain closed the distance to finish them off. They followed much the same tactic for the second one. Anna was adept with her mace, but given that they were relying on her to keep them all healthy and functional, the group agreed it was best for her not to get directly involved, unless the danger of her being injured was minimal. Speaking of keeping the squad healthy and functional, Anna suggested that they use the spare area within the fort to create a small infirmary. It was near the defences at the front of the fort, which was perfect for getting injured squad members treated quickly, and would provide a clean area for her to deal with their wounds. To develop the defences further, they filled in some of the trenches nearest to the fort and replaced them with embrasures, walls with small gaps in them that would provide plenty of cover for their archers, while still allowing the archers to fire out and inflict damage on approaching attackers. Unfortunately, the quiet that followed the last attack was interrupted when Kaisuke came down with the plague, but at least now they had a nice infirmary where he could be tended to and rest up, making a full recovery all but assured. It was around this time that one of the nearby factions also decided to attack. Whether they knew that the hammer-wielding maniac Kaisuke was out of the action, or if they just got lucky, it was undoubtedly unfortunate timing. The group appeared to be Neanderthals. Although they lacked any ranged weapons, they were known to be very resilient to pain, so it was vital that the squad inflicted as much damage as possible before they could close the melee range. The captain pulled out his crossbow to join Farrell and Jesse in doling out the ranged punishment. Although they got close, the barricade slowed them down enough to allow the group to reorient, with the captain and Anna closing in on the attackers and managing to take down a second attacker in short order, causing the final attacker to flee in terror. Although the captain wasn't entirely sold on the idea, he allowed Anna to capture one of the attackers. Anna thought she'd won the captain over by convincing him that she could get the attacker to join them and help protect the place. But the captain mostly just enjoyed seeing her passion to help people, even those that were deemed their enemies, so he indulged her, on the understanding that she would have sole responsibility for the prisoner. Shortly after this attack, the squad were subjected to devastation when Farrell suggested to the captain that they break up. It was a truly dark day at the fort, and everyone spent the night in silent contemplation. Except for the prisoner, who spent it groaning in pain due to an infection. The next night, yet another raiding party arrived at the fort. The danger was starting to increase more in line with what the squad had anticipated from the start. With the raiding party seemingly taking their time to plan out their attack, the squad used the additional time to position a few extra traps. The embrasures were still a work in progress, but the group still had a positional advantage, with the archers taking up spots on the side of the approaching raiders, whilst Kaisuke and Anna blocked the only unobstructed path to the archers. This would cause the raiders to either risk injury slowly clambering over the barricades whilst the archers took shots at them, or to approach Kaisuke and Anna via the trap-laden entryway gauntlet. The attackers had picked a poor angle, as they also had to traverse the river, all whilst under fire from the archers. But once they crossed that first obstacle, they elected to clamber over the barricades, making a beeline for the archers. Farrell and Jesse retreated further back, whilst Kaisuke and Anna pulled forward to face the raiders that made it over the barrier. In order to protect the less armoured Jesse and Farrell, the captain pulled out his axe and stood side by side with Kaisuke and Anna. Watching Kaisuke smash 3 of their comrades into a swift oblivion, the remaining 2 attackers thought that desertion seemed like a much more promising prospect, and turned tail to run. The squad barely have enough time to recover from their previous fight before another attack begins, this time with more Neanderthals. They had barely had a chance to do anything in the interim, aside from create a wonderfully intricate mask for Anna. Maybe it would serve to scare the approaching Neanderthals. Although she'd mostly just requested it because she thought it was a cool idea. With their new embrasures finally in place, the group took up defensive positions, feeling quite certain in their ability to defend themselves. This time around, the attackers approached via the death gauntlet. Unfortunately for the squad, the hardiness of Neanderthals meant that they were struggling to take them down before they got to the end, and even Kaisuke was having trouble dispatching those that got close. Despite the best efforts of Jesse and Farrell to land some hits, the fight at the front of the gates turned into a brutal slugging match, which resulted in both the captain and Anna hitting the ground. Thankfully, Kaisuke and his love of combat kept him standing longer than anyone else in the melee. He then moved over to help Jesse and Farrell, who had been forced to engage in close quarters combat with one of the attackers, who Kaisuke made short work of. With everyone in the group having sustained some form of injury in the fight, Jesse and Farrell tended to each other quickly before tending to the captain and Anna, whilst Kaisuke, who refused to be involved in medical work, retreated back to the fort to relax a little. Anna's abilities were becoming more powerful over time, but that didn't change the fact that she couldn't use them on herself, so whilst everyone else was benefiting from them, she simply had to endure the pain of her wounds until nature took its course. The intense stress of their current situation, along with her immense pain, led her straight into a mental breakdown, which saw her attempt to storm into the jail cell and murder her prisoner in a fit of rage. What her rage made her forget, however, is that she was severely injured, and her prisoner was a super resilient Neanderthal, so he quickly put her on her ass and tried to make his escape. Kaisuke knew that once Anna came to her senses, she would be sad if any harm had befallen the prisoner, as his capture was her decision and he was under her care. As such, he attempted to subdue the prisoner peacefully, but the prisoner was surprisingly uncooperative. His existing injuries, however, meant that Kaisuke also went down against the well-rested prisoner. Farrell managed to land a few good hits on the prisoner, whilst keeping her distance, but he was still going. The captain stumbled upon the scene of utter chaos and decided to get involved. He had dropped his weapon when he got down during the initial attack, but it turned out he was quite effective at beating people with his shield. Unfortunately, they were unable to subdue the prisoner without killing him, which would probably cause Anna some heartbreak once she was conscious again. The captain was forced to admit to himself that placing the rookie who'd never experienced combat before in charge of a prisoner was probably not the most sensible decision he'd ever made. The gods clearly decided that Anna needed to face some form of poetic justice for her attempted murder, so an infection set in on her foot, which had been injured in the fight with the prisoner. It soon became clear that without her ability to cure herself, Anna would succumb to the infection. As a veteran of many campaigns, Jesse could recognise the signs, and recommended to the captain the only course of action he could think of: amputation. And so it was that Anna's first mission caused her to lose her left foot, as a direct result of her attempt to murder her own prisoner. The first attack had clearly been part of a larger plan from the Neanderthals, as they launched their second assault in rapid succession, whilst the squad was still battered and bruised from the first attack. The defence gets off to a rocky start, with the captain suffering a breakdown and no one being in position. While Anna vomits her guts out inside, Kaisuke, Jesse and Farrell manage to rally to the front of the fort, but the attackers are already very close. With his existing injuries, Kaisuke can't withstand the beating for long. The attackers quickly move on to Farrell, and Anna goes down in a single hit. Not sure how he's going to get out of this, Jesse turns tail and dashes back into the fort. He masterfully allows one of the attackers to follow him inside, before turning on a dime and launching an arrow straight through her heart. While the fields outside burn, Jesse exits to the rear of the fort, hoping to get the attention of the attackers and drag them backwards through the defences once again. Unfortunately, one of the attackers is already at the side of the fort to greet him. He's forced to retreat, at which point he notices one of the other attackers has made their way behind him, looking to box him in. He has no option but to keep running. Back at the fort, Kaisuke and Farrell have managed to drag themselves inside, but the attackers have broken down the gate and let themselves in. After a brief search for the artifact, which was hidden away in the storage room, the attackers decided to simply set fire to the whole fort. If they couldn't have it, no one could. Jesse was still on the run, trying to formulate a plan as he went, when he heard the arrival of some traders in the area. Desperately hoping they would be able to offer him aid, he began heading in their direction. With Anna and the captain both back on their feet, they slowly made their way out of the blazing inferno in the fort, and took up positions in the entryway once more. Kaisuke is also feeling good enough to move, but the insane heat in the fort puts him down once more before he is able to escape. Jesse finally manages to get the traders to engage in combat with the attackers, and he uses the opportunity to race back to the fort, hoping that he can help save the rest of the squad. With Farrell stuck in the hospital being roasted alive by the searing temperatures, Jesse starts ripping down one of the external walls so that he can get her out without exposing himself to the heat. With Farrell out of immediate danger, he rushes back in to grab Anna and begins tending to her in amongst the carnage of their defensive line. The captain, on his feet once more, rushes in to drag Kaisuke out of the inferno. It seems as though, despite all of the carnage and chaos, they'd managed not to lose any of the squad. They have, however, lost large portions of the fort to their ravenous fire. But even there were some blessings. Being a mostly stone structure, the fire had not been able to reach the top of the fort, leaving their storage room with all of its food, and most importantly the artifact, entirely untouched. Their defences also remained intact, although the number of corpses and rivers of blood represented a clear and present biohazard. With the fires eradicated, they had little choice but to begin rebuilding the fort. They started with a change to the design, however, building the doors out of bone instead of wood. The bone would be less flammable, reducing the chances of another inferno, and they certainly had plenty of bones to spare. As well as replacing the doors and fixing the hole in the wall of the hospital, they made sure to focus on rebuilding the traps at the front of the fort. The way things stood at the moment, if they were subjected to another attack, they'd have no chance of holding it off, but the traps would give them some leeway in such an event. One of the many reasons that the squad's morale was low was that they were being subjected to a sea of corpses on a regular basis, and this sea was only getting larger with each attack. Although there was a lot of other work to be done, Anna suggested that they build a wall around the area they were using to dump the corpses. She suggested it would reduce the risk of biohazards, but really it was just making everyone sad. They used wood for these walls for two reasons. The first was so that they could erect them quickly and move on to other tasks, and the second was so that if the walls did catch fire, it might also spread to the pile of corpses, helping to rid the squad of them once and for all. With all of their beds rebuilt, along with a new stone table and bench, it was finally time for the squad to start cleaning off all the blood, guts, soot and grime from the floors of the fortress, bringing it back once more to being a livable space. For a moment there, they doubted if any of them were going to make it through, but with a healthy dose of hard work and all of the squad pitching in, they'd managed to renew their hope alongside the fort. That night, the squad all settled down in the main hall to have a small party, to celebrate just being alive, something which no longer felt promised to them. Despite prison breaks, amputations, mental breakdowns, infernos, murder, and enough bodies to build another fortress out of, the squad were making it through this. The captain wasn't sure if anyone else had been keeping track, but he decided to keep it to himself that they'd only managed to hold out for 20 days so far, and there was a lot more ahead of them. Hey folks, Tuna here, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed all this chaotic little mess. Full disclosure, I fully anticipated this being a single episode, but I ended up with so much chaos condensed into the 60-day period that I decided to split it into two, so you can expect part 2 of that coming up soonish. Until then though, I hope life is treating you all well, and I shall see you then.